Hello from Idaho. My name is Elizabeth Manley. It's nice to meet you guys, and it'll be nice to see everyone. um, Edward Scissorhands. That was an interesting film, to say the least. It threw me for a bit of a loop, but the questions that Professor wanted us to review and discuss a bit were definitely fitting ones. I'm just going to read those questions, and then we'll get started. Question 1. When did the movie first hook me, and why? Question 2. What is the message of this movie? Do I agree or disagree? Explain. Question 3. What is Edward's main desire? Compare it to the desires of Frankenstein's monster. Question 4. Examine how Edward first responds to his environment. How does this compare to the monster's reaction to his environment in Frankenstein? Chapter 5. Consider Jim and Joyce, the main antagonists from Edward Scissorhands. How do they treat Edward? What is the message director Tim Burton is trying to send to his audience about those actions? How do these villains compare to the villain, or villains, in Frankenstein? Question 6. Discuss the importance between the relationships of two of the characters and how it contributes to the story's purpose. Question 7. What is the director saying about humanity, both good and bad? Expand and compare to Shelley. Well, as I said earlier, this film threw me for a bit of a loop. But in response to the first question, it hooked me almost immediately. It was well done. The screenplay was fantastic, and that blended with the music created an intriguing blend of mystery. It piqued my curiosity, and it set off a bit of my fear factor. I scare easily, and so as I started to watch this movie, I was like, oh my goodness, what did I get myself into? So I guess a lot of what I would applaud the team behind this film for doing is just syncing the screenplay and the music in such a manner that there's an air of extraordinary mystique and like I said earlier, drama that first ensues upon seeing the first few scenes of this film. And one specific scene that definitely makes the audience made me, and I'm sure the rest of you guys, a little intrigued, was the comment by this white old white-haired old lady who turns to this little girl in a bed, and she goes, "Snuggle in, sweetie, it's cold out there." And it's like, okay then, creepy. So I would say that definitely hooked me almost initially. It was well done. The second question, what is the message of this movie, and do I agree or disagree? As I studied this a bit and was trying to think through an answer to this question, I came upon a quote by the screenwriter, and her name was Carolyn Thompson, and she stated this: "Everyone feels like an outsider. That's the story we were telling, and that's the story people still respond to." And my references to this quote are in my PowerPoint, but it was I definitely agree with that. That is, I think those are good words to relay the message of this film. And it's a very relatable message. It's one that we see and that we understand, that we've walked through. And simply being, Edward wanted love. He wanted acceptance. And that's the story of an outsider stepping into a group of insiders and watching the struggle, watching the pain, watching the questions and the desires in his own soul, and the turmoil because of that. Question 3. What is Edward's main desire? Compare it to the desires of Frankenstein's monster. Now, that's an intriguing thought, because before I read this question, I hadn't realized how similar Edward was to Frankenstein's monster. The desires bear striking resemblance to one another, and that desire was to be accepted, to be loved, to be appreciated, to be who they were, and not endure intense persecution because of it. And beyond that, on a deeper level, what they desired was not just friendship love, they wanted relationship love. They wanted a love that filled the deep void in their souls, the love that all humans are born desiring. The thing that saddens me about both of these, both this novel and this film, are that Edward and Frankenstein's monster, they went about filling this void for love in a completely different manner than what we as believers are called to fill it. We're called to fill it with the sufficient blood and love of Jesus Christ. For God so loved me that he gave his only begotten Son on my behalf. And Edward and Frankenstein chose a different route, and because of that, they never had those intense desires and emotions that they were walking through. They never had them fully satiated or fulfilled. Question 4. Examine how Edward first responds to his environment. How does this compare to the monster's reaction to his environment in Frankenstein? These also were strikingly similar. Edward, I don't know, I see him as he's riding home in the car, riding to his new home in the car, he seems just delighted. I mean, he's like ecstatic, but confused and concerned and a little scared and just unsure of what's happening. But he's excited and he's anticipating something. And Frankenstein's monster was similar. He left the confines of Victor's room and went out into a world that he knew nothing of, and yet he was intrigued by and interested in and deeply desired to experience. He was curious and he was scared and he was confused. And it's intriguing to me how similar these two stories were. However, they differed rather soon. Frankenstein's monster was rejected. He had no understanding of what acceptance meant. He never was able to experience love, and Edward was. Edward, although rejected at one point in the film, he was embraced with open arms, and that's where their stories differ. They're similar up to that point. Question 5. Consider Jim and Joyce, the two main antagonists. How do they treat Edward? What is the message director Tim Burton is trying to send to his audience about their actions? And how do these villains compare to the villains in Frankenstein? This is a multifaceted question requiring several answers, but we'll start with just examining who Joyce and Jim were. And Jim was Kim's boyfriend, and Joyce was the woman who was trying to kind of seduce Edward a bit. And they were definitely antagonists. It's interesting to me because what I began to understand about them parallels to what I understand about the villains in Frankenstein. And the villains in Frankenstein are Victor Frankenstein himself and the monster. And the similarities I see there come from all of those villains had a deep lust for self-gratification. They desired to fill themselves up. They had high self-esteem. They thought of themselves better than, with more regard than they should have. And that's what made them a bully. Because as soon as anyone or anything threatened their brilliance, intelligence, security, or means by which they could gain approval, they turned on them. And that's what made them villains. That was the similarities between them. And I think what Tim Burton was trying to relay to his audience was how relatable those bullies, those antagonists are in our lives. Because as individuals, we all have experienced that struggle either firsthand or have watched others being attacked by antagonists. And we realize that no matter how peaceful we could be or how much we desire just to be loved or to love in return, if we try to threaten the security of an antagonist, one whose focus is on themselves and on fulfilling their own desires, it's a losing cause. And question 6. Question 6. Discuss the importance between the relationships of to the characters in this film and how it contributes to the story's purpose. The characters I chose were Kim and Edward, and I believe that their story, their relationship, was definitely a key part. Well, it was obviously a key part of this film, but what it relayed, what it portrays to an audience, is that Edward had a hole, a void in his heart, and the only way he could think to fill it, the only way that drew him, and naturally so, rightfully so, was in a relationship of romantic love with a girl. And yet God, when we're created in God's image, we're created for bigger things, and we're created to have that hole and that desire filled by our bridegroom, Jesus Christ. And so I find that intriguing that they use the parallel of that story to portray the sources that humanity turns to again and again, and yet always fails. Question 7 states, what is the director saying about humanity, both good and bad? Expand and compare to Shelley. I think Burton was trying to relate to his audience that humanity was interesting. It had so many facets. There's examples of joy in that movie. There's example of unity, of love, of encouragement, of compassion, of kindness, and yet there's also there's also emotions of self-gratification and arrogance and selfishness, lust, flirting, heavy tendency to rely on emotional turbulence and reactions as well. And I think Shelley was different. She approached humanity in a much less hopeful way, and she tended to portray more in depth the arrogance and the selfishness of mankind. This was definitely an intriguing film. It was worth watching, and one that I appreciated thinking through. So thank you for the questions, and I hope you enjoyed. Have a wonderful day. Bye.